Today I thought it would be fun to paint this simple chalkboard Tic Tac Toe Valentine's theme subject. To begin, I've gone ahead and drawn out the subject on some Arches cold press paper, and I've secured it with painter's tape, making sure that my dimensions are 5 by 7 so it'll easily fit a frame size. You can see that I have my pencil lines pretty dark right now, which will work just fine considering our subject has so many dark colors that our pencil lines will easily be able to cover up. However, we need to protect these white areas so we can paint our background more easily and get those bright whites against the black that we see in the reference photo. So to do that, I'm going to use some colorless art masking fluid from Winsor Newton. And I'm going to use just a sculpting tool. It's called a tapered point number 2. It's just kind of a rubber applicator to apply the masking fluid. Now, if you don't have one of these tools in your art supplies, that's fine. What I recommend as an alternative is to grab a brush that you care less for and use either brush cleaner or a bar of soap. And what you're going to do is you're going to wet your brush with water. You're going to coat the outside of the brush bristles with the bar of soap or your brush cleaner, and that's going to add a layer of protection. And then you're going to go to your masking fluid and apply it to your watercolor paper. After you apply, you're going to then re-rinse your brush because we don't want that masking fluid to dry on the brush. It will damage it. And you're going to recoat the outside of the bristles with your bar of soap, giving that layer of protection, and you're going to re-dip in your masking fluid and repeat the process. I prefer to avoid using my brushes with masking fluid at all costs. So for me personally, I'm going to use this rubber applicator. It's technically a sculpting tool and it doesn't cost very much if you pursue purchasing one for yourself. So with this masking fluid, excuse me, I'm going to dip it in my masking fluid, and the white highlights on each heart I'm going to protect with the masking fluid. Since this is a rubber applicator, I don't have to keep rinsing or worrying about damage, because if it were to dry on the tip, I can just peel it off. So I've masked the highlight in each heart. I'm now going to use this masking fluid to mask the line that's made with white chalk. And I'm not drawing the line. I don't want it to be smooth. I want it to kind of reflect that rough chalkboard surface. So I'm dabbing, and I'm making sure that it's not perfect, allowing gaps in between my masking fluid strokes. Now, if we look at our reference photo, you'll notice that we're at a little bit of an angle. So the line that is closest to us is a bit thicker in dimension versus the line that's furthest from us, where it's a little thinner because it's further away. So I'm going to keep this in mind when I apply my masking fluid, making sure that I'm thicker at the front edge versus the back edge. This takes some time, but it's going to make the process of painting this image so much easier and faster. We don't want to use masking fluid as a crutch. We just want to use it on those small, delicate whites that would be difficult to paint around and avoid with our paintbrush. And I think this textured chalk line is the perfect example of when we would want to use masking fluid. So I've got my first line painted and it needs to dry, so I'm just going to work on the others. If your masking fluid goes on a little too thick, you can either wait till it dries and remove it, or you can use a paper towel and dab the surface of it while it's wet. So you can kind of bring that masking fluid level down so it's not so thick. That will also ensure that it dries in a decent amount of time. If you allow the masking fluid to get too thick, it will take a very long time to dry, and sometimes we're just excited to paint and we don't want to have to wait for that. I'm going to continue this process for all of the lines, kind of dabbing and allowing spacing between my masking fluid, because again I want to imply that texture. Whenever I'm dipping into my masking fluid, I'm constantly wiping off my applicator on the edge of the jar to make sure I don't have any big gobs that might drop onto my surface. Now before I started applying my masking fluid, I did take a squirt bottle with water in it, and I squirted the surface of my watercolor paints so that while I'm doing this, my paints can soften to make it easier for me to get darker, more vibrant colors when I'm mixing. I tend to work with watercolors from a tube, and they dry when I'm not using them. So I just use a squirt bottle to kind of reactivate the paints so they're easier to work with. I'm going to do the same thing to my X's. I want to get that textured line. My masking fluid is beginning to dry on my applicator here, so I'm just going to use a paper towel to wipe that off. So I have a nice thin tip again. It's just going to make it easier for me to work with. Now there are some areas that I feel like my masking fluid got a little too thick. So for example, this area right here on my X is pretty thick. I also think that this area over here is pretty thick as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually lift that with a paper towel so I can reapply to make sure it's thinner. I don't want you to overlook the importance of how you apply your masking fluid, because it's as important as if you were to be painting with white paint. So if you're using masking fluid, I encourage you to take the time to really analyze how you applied it and ask yourself if there's any areas that you feel could be improved. Because once you paint over this, there's really no going back. So I'm just using my paper towel to kind of lift those thick areas so I can reapply my masking fluid more thinly. Now I need to wait until my masking fluid dries. Some areas still have an opaque white appearance. That means they're still wet and need further time to dry before you begin painting. Other areas are completely dry, transparent, and have kind of this off-white appearance, and that lets us know that it's completely dry and ready for paint. I do not recommend speeding up the drying process using a heat element like a hairdryer, because that can actually cause the masking fluid to permanently bond to your paper, making it more difficult to lift later and possibly causing damage to your paper's surface. So be patient. It only takes maybe 5 minutes to completely dry. When your masking fluid is dry, we can go ahead and mix up the paint we plan on using. However, I want you to make sure that you switch out the water that now looks milky from using your masking fluid. We don't want to use this for our actual paints because it will give them a duller appearance and they won't be as vibrant. So switch out your water cup that you rinsed your masking fluid in for a water cup that's clean and clear. And we're going to start by mixing the dark black for the background. I'm going to use Payne's Gray. I like to always have a scrap piece of watercolor paper nearby. Once I feel like I've mixed up a dark value of the color I plan on using, I'm going to wipe my brush off on the rim of my palette so I don't have any big drips on the tip of my brush. And I'm going to test out the color on my scrap piece of watercolor paper. If it's the value I want, that's fantastic. We're ready to go. But we need to keep in mind that since we will be applying water to our paper first, this is going to be further diluted down and it's not going to be as dark as we see on our scrap piece of paper. It's going to be about 20% lighter. So I'm going to actually add more pigment to my puddle to make sure it's a really nice, rich color, so that with the added water on my paper surface, it will end up drying to the proper value that I want. So I'm going to go ahead and rinse my brush now. And I'm going to use a large round brush with clean water. And I'm going to wet the entire surface without touching my red hearts. Now, if you didn't have confidence in being able to avoid the red hearts using your brush control, you could have masked off the outer edge of the hearts using the masking fluid. Forgive me, I have a little bit of a cold. But I've been working with a paintbrush for quite a while now, so I have relatively good confidence that I can work around these hearts without getting any water inside their shape. So on my first application of water, I'm keeping it pretty heavy-handed because I know that this is the first time water has been introduced to this paper, and it's going to be absorbed pretty quickly. So I want to apply a thick amount of water so it stays wet and it doesn't dry as fast. Now I'm keeping my paper stationary just for ease of you guys following me in the painting process. But if you're working it there in your own environment, I recommend rotating your paper at whatever angle it takes to get around those hearts with comfort and ease. So if rotating your paper makes it easier for you to get around the outside shape, please do that. Now I want my paper to have a sheen to it, an even sheen all the way around. I don't want there to be any big standing puddles. And I'm applying the water with light, gentle pressure. I don't want to accidentally push too hard because that may cause the masking fluid that I've applied to peel up. So once I have my water down, I'm going to take a look at it from different angles in the light, making sure I haven't missed any areas and making sure I don't have any thick puddles of water. Once it's nice and even, I can begin applying my Payne's Gray. And I'm going to coat the entire surface with this color. And you can already see that masking fluid is resisting the paint. I'm going to move my water cups out of the way so I can kind of rotate my painting to make sure I get around these hearts. I am holding my brush at an angle so I can clearly see where the tip of my brush is, giving me confidence of where my paint edge will be. And I'm going really slow around the shape of my hearts. I love to have clean edges. And if we don't take our time, we end up with edges that we may not be as proud of. So rotate your paper if it means making it easier for you. And get around that outside edge of your heart. I'm making sure that my Payne's gray is still nice and rich and dark, but it's not so dark that I can't see the paper through my paint. I don't want it to be too thick. I still want it to be watery. Some areas of my paper are starting to lose their shine, which means they're beginning to dry. So I'm going to apply my Payne's gray over top of them to make sure that they stay wet, so I have some working time. So before my background dries, I need to do two things. I need to make sure that the edge around my hearts are satisfactory, that they're not bumpy and that they're smooth. I also want to make sure my value is as dark as I'd like it. And I need to establish the shadows on the lower edge of each heart. So right now I'm going to take the opportunity to darken up the top edge, smooth out my color. And right there, I accidentally went directly over my heart. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to overcome that. So don't panic. I'm trying not to panic myself right now. But I'm not going to edit this part out of the video because I think it's important for you to see that every artist makes mistakes, and I want to show you how to overcome them. I'm going to dab the surface of my heart before that paint dries. And if I need to, I can scrub the surface with a clean, damp brush. And I'm pressing firmly with a clean paper towel to make sure the color doesn't continue to move into that heart shape. And since I'm working on quality paper, I'm confident that I can use a damp brush and kind of scrub the surface to pick up as much of that color as possible without causing damage to the paper. So I'm going to give that a moment to kind of dry more thoroughly. In the meantime, I'm going to be more careful, and I'm going to continue to apply my Payne's Gray around the rest of my background. I am human. Sorry, guys. For some reason, when I'm recording, I get a little flustered because it's new territory for me. I'm just trying to clean up the edge to this heart. I feel like I could have done a better job on the first pass. And since I'm continuing to reapply my Payne's Gray, my surface still has that nice sheen to it. And the reason I keep applying is to make sure it doesn't begin to dry before I can go around the edge of this heart here. And I also want to make sure that it's going to be a dark enough value that when it dries, I'm happy with it. So now that this area's had some time to dry, I'm going to go up against the edge . All right, so now, before this dries completely, I need to establish the shadows that are below each heart. And in order to get that nice soft edge, I need to do it while my background is wet. So I'm going to clean off my large brush. I'm going to set it aside, and I'm going to get a smaller brush. Depending on how large you want your mark on your wet paper is going to dictate the size of the brush that you use. Basically, the smaller the brush, the less paint it holds, therefore the less paint it's going to drop into your background. If you use a larger brush, it's going to hold a lot more paint. So then when you tap it onto a wet background, it's going to leave a larger dimension. So I'm going to use a smaller brush, and I need to make sure I get a really dark mixture of my Payne's Gray. So I'm going directly to my pigment. And underneath each heart, I'm going to add this darker value of Payne's Gray. And since the surface of my paper is still wet, it's going to give me some soft edges when it dries. And that's just going to give some three-dimensionality to our painting. I'm going to rinse my brush completely. And there's one area of my painting where I feel like my background grays are pretty dark to the point where my shadow on the underside of my heart isn't that visible. So I'm going to take a clean barely damp brush. So it's damp enough to form the bristles, but it's pretty dry for the most part. And I'm going to use this to just gently lift some of the color above the heart and below my shadow. That way it's a little bit more obvious, my shadow, because I enjoy having that contrast. And you can only do this when your paper is still wet. If your paper is already beginning to lose its sheen, then your working time has ended. So this is kind of the first step of our painting. We're going to let this dry completely, and then we're going to work on our hearts. And believe it or not, since our reds are so dark, we're going to barely be able to see the mistake that I made. And I hope you enjoy being able to see how to correct things like that when we're painting. Okay, when you think your background is completely dry and it's lost all shine, I want you to touch the background with the back of your hand. If your background is still cold to the touch, it's possible that it is actually still wet, so I recommend giving it more time or hitting it with the blow dryer. Now that my background is completely dry, I've noticed a couple things and I want to talk to you about them just in case you come across them in your paintings. If you look really closely, above this heart, I have a faint white edge. And what that's from is when I drew out my subject using pencil, I used too much pressure and it created an indentation in my paper, which then made it difficult for the paint to get inside. So if you see just a tiny thin white line along the edge of where your drawing is, that's what happened. And that's okay, it's just the nature of the painting. Just be aware of your pressure when you draw out your next subject. Now another thing I want to discuss is, now that my background has dried, I can take the opportunity to more clearly see how I applied my masking fluid and whether or not I'm going to be satisfied with it. I think for the most part, I'm pretty happy with the texture I achieved with the way I applied my masking fluid. However, I do notice this area here that it appears my masking fluid was so thin that when I lift it, I might have some splotchiness right here and it may not be to my liking. So we're just going to see when we remove the masking fluid. So to remove the masking fluid, you can use either your hands. However, since I'm always working with graphite and paint, sometimes the tips of my fingers are not always the cleanest. So I prefer to use what is called a rubber cement pickup. They cost about 75 cents. And what happens is when you go to lift the masking fluid itself actually bonds to the edge of your rubber cement pickup. And it allows a more clean working space. If I were to use my fingers to rub it off, those little flakes of masking fluid are all over my work surface, and I run the risk of them being on my painting and getting in the way. So I like using a rubber cement pickup, and I just use it like an eraser. And when it gets thick on the edge, I just pull it off and put it in a nearby trash can. Now here's that area that I was concerned about, and I'll talk about how to correct that. My camera is going to shake a little bit while I do this because I'm shaking the table. Sorry about that. Now I'm not going to remove the masking fluid from the center of my heart because I still need to paint those. I'm just focusing on the chalk lines because I want to be able to see the end result and whether or not there are areas that I want to touch up. So now that I believe I've removed all the masking fluid from the chalk lines, I'm going to use my fingers to just touch the areas where the masking fluid was, just to confirm that I don't have any little bumps, indicating that there's still some masking fluid that needs to be removed. Now that I've removed all the masking fluid on my chalk lines, I'm going to switch to a smaller brush with my Payne's Gray, and I'm going to touch up that area of my chalk. So I'm going to get a brush that has a nice tip on it. I'm going to get it wet. I'm going to get my dark Payne's Gray mixture. And I just want to separate this area a little more. So I separated the white shape into smaller shapes and covered up the areas that I do not want. I'm going to do the same thing over here. And I'm just going to let that dry. I'm not going to fiddle too much with trying to get clean edges on where I just applied, because I know from experience when you're working on a background that's really dark and already painted, all it takes is a damp brush to begin lifting those previous layers, and it's going to just cause more damage to your background than is necessary. So sometimes when it comes to adding touch-ups and trying to achieve perfection in your painting, you have to ask yourself, is it worth it? Or am I possibly just going to cause more damage, making the end painting something I dislike altogether? So I'm just going to leave it as is, and I'm going to begin focusing on my hearts. So I've got a couple different values of red for my hearts. Some are a lighter red, so we'll use more water, and some are a darker red, so I can use more pigment and add a touch of that Payne's Gray to deepen it up and make it more of a burgundy color. So for this, I'm going to use a mixture of my alizarin crimson. And you don't have to have the same colors I do. You can work with the pigments that you have there at home and just get close with the colors you have. And I'm going to use just a little bit of the cadmium red. I always have my scrap paper close on hand, so I'm going to test out my color and make sure I like it. And we have to keep in mind that the color we mix up, when it's wet, it appears quite dark and vibrant, but when it dries, it's actually going to dry about 20% lighter. So right now I'm a little dark for that soft red, but I know from experience when it dries, it'll be lighter in value, so I think I'm going to be pretty spot on. Now I want to mix up my darker red, more of a burgundy. So I'm going to use my alizarin crimson again. I'm going to have quite a bit more pigment this time. But I'm going to add just a small touch of Payne's Gray to kind of darken it up and give it more of a burgundy color. And I like how that looks. Now, since we have our masking fluid on the little white reflections of each heart, I can just go in and paint these hearts without worrying about going around those. So I'm just going to put just a tiny bit of water on the inside of my heart, not getting outside my shape. And I'm going to put the soft red all over my heart. And if it makes it easier for you to get inside the shape of your heart by rotating your paper, go for it. Now, while my heart is wet, I'm going to switch to a smaller brush, and I'm going to grab some of my dark burgundy, and in just a few areas, I'm going to add this dark burgundy just to kind of give it that marbled effect. Now, this is just the first layer. I will actually be going over top after this dries to add some hard edges to more successfully achieve that marbled effect that these little glass hearts have. Right now I'm just trying to get a range of values. Now I'm going to move on to the next heart while that one dries. And I'm just going to repeat the process. Just putting a thin layer of clean water down. Depending on the pace of which you paint, you may not have to put water first if you feel like you can really get the whole heart painted without it drying midway. I'm going to grab more of my alizarin crimson and cadmium red. Now this is a pretty easy painting. So if you wanted, you could actually do a few of these paintings for friends and family since Valentine's is coming up. And depending on who it is you're gifting it to, you can change the color of your hearts. You could even have one heart, one color, and make each one different. Maybe one blue, one green. So make it your own. Don't feel like you have to be within the restraints of the reference photo. So I feel like this is a little bit more on the orange side versus my first heart. So I'm going to add just a little bit of the alizarin crimson to try and get the colors a little closer. Now, since I had that whoops earlier, some of that soft Payne's gray that was already within the shape of my heart is making my reds appear a little bit more on the burgundy side, which is fine because I'll be able to cover that up. However, I do want to get a little bit more burgundies on this bottom edge. So I'm using my small brush . And I'm just putting a couple darker spots. And I'll come back later to add other effects. On to heart number 3. And while it's wet, get some of that burgundy. I'm just looking at my reference photo to see the few areas that I might have this color. If I need to water it down to have a softer version, that's fine too. And now I'm going to let these hearts dry, or I can hit them with a blow dryer. Now that my hearts are completely dry, I am able to continue adding additional texture on my hearts using a wet on dry technique, giving myself some hard edges. Now I have some really tiny brushes in my arsenal, and when I'm working on small areas, I really like to have a small brush. So this is a really microscopic brush, but it allows me to add additional details with confidence that they're not going to get too big. So I'm using a really tiny detail brush. It's called a Spotter Petite, and I'm going to go in above my reflection and try and capture the shape I see in my reference photo. So I'm using a Payne's Gray, and I see a little bit of Payne's Gray in each of my hearts. Now the one thing I don't like about these little petite brushes is they don't hold a whole lot of moisture. Or water, I should say. Now I can go to my burgundy color. I'm just going to add some of those marbling details. So my eyes are constantly going back and forth between my reference photo and my painting. And I'm occasionally pausing to really give my eye a chance to focus on the shape and correctly interpret where it's located. Now, as long as we properly mimic the texture, it doesn't have to be photorealistic or anything like that. I'm going to use the same burgundy on the next heart. So now I have some nice burgundy effects in each of my hearts, but I feel like I've lost some of the contrast that I want. So what I'm going to do is to improve the contrast, I have the option of either darkening the background behind my heart, which since it already is a dark value, I don't feel like that would be the most successful choice. So my next option would be to lift some of the areas on my heart to lighten the hearts themselves. That way I can improve the contrast overall. So I think that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to take a small brush that is damp. It's not dripping with water. Okay. And I'm going to go into my hearts and I'm going to find the areas that I feel are the lightest in my reference photo. And I'm going to do little circles with a light scrub to kind of soften some of the reds so they're a little more bright, especially on the top half. Now I am not going to dab the surface of my heart because that would lift almost all the color, and I still want there to be a soft pink. But by gently just running a damp brush over some of these areas, I'm able to soften the red and improve the contrast. Now, if you already have that contrast, then fantastic. Your painting might already be done. And I'm not going to do it everywhere, just enough to make a difference. Focusing more on the top edge. You may have noticed that I'm frequently rinsing my brush because when I'm dragging a damp brush over the surface of my heart to lighten the value, my brush is actually picking up that paint and it's being held in the bristles of my brush. So instead of continuing to push that paint around, I just rinse my brush and dab on a nearby sponge or paper towel to have a clean, damp brush before I go to the next section. Now I feel like that's helped the contrast and make my hearts pop out a little bit more. Lastly, I need to take my rubber cement pickup to remove the masking fluid on each of my hearts. And I can use a small spotter brush if necessary to modify the edge of my reflection. It shouldn't be a perfect circle, so look at your reference photo for inspiration. And there we have it. Carefully remove your painter's tape. I'm pulling away from my painting. I do not pull in towards my painting. And I have a nice clean edge. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a good day.